Would you like a quick, beginner-friendly way to finish your quilt without the fuss of mitered corners or cutting bias strips? In this step-by-step video, I'll show you how to round the corners of your quilt and finish it off with a great-looking binding that uses regular fabric strips. You'll get a smooth, polished finish, no special tools, and no cutting on the bias. Welcome. I'm Beth Williams, and Braun and I are happy to share this beginner-friendly, completely machine-sewn method that looks great and saves time, especially if mitered corners feel intimidating or maybe you just like the rounded look. We'll cover how to round the corners of your quilt with no special rulers, how to select a binding fabric, how to cut and join the binding strips with no bias cuts, how to prep the binding for best results, how to sew the binding to the back of your quilt, and how to finish the binding on the front of your quilt. This is the quilt I'm going to be working on today. It's one of the samples I made for the Easy Pieces pattern, featuring fabrics designed by Tulip Pink. I chose this quilt because I wanted to make the point that there are no rules about borders. You can have no borders on your quilt, you can have borders just on two sides like most of these samples, or you can have borders on all four sides like you see most often. Whatever you like. Here's a close-up of one corner before trimming. And if you're wondering what that is in the upper left-hand corner of the photo, it's just a bowl that I'm using to weigh down the quilt so it doesn't slip off the table. I've grabbed a large dinner plate from my kitchen to use as my cutting guide. I'm using a 28mm rotary cutter since the smaller size is a little easier to guide smoothly around curves, but a regular 45mm cutter would work too. Trim all four corners the same way. For best results, use a plate or a platter that is at least 10 to 12 inches across, as that will give you a nice, gentle curve. Anything smaller than that, and it might be challenging to sew without bias strips. Now that all four corners are rounded, let's take a quick minute to talk about choosing fabric for a quilt binding. Once again, there are no rules, but I like to audition my fabrics by placing the edge of the quilt on top of the fabric I'm thinking about. You'll notice that I'm avoiding batiks. They won't be as flexible as regular quilting weight cotton, so they're not as good for this technique. I started with the matching purple binding, but felt that there was enough purple in the quilt already. So next, I tried this pink and green stripe, but that fabric felt too flat and dull in comparison to the kitties. The speckled green almost worked for me, but I wanted to pull out more of the teal green than the warm greens. So, finally, just a second here, and you'll see the winner. This fabric is dark enough in value that it balances the deep purple that's in the border while still picking up the contrasting teal greens in a subtle way. And I really like the visual texture of this design. So that's the winner. Now that I've chosen my fabric, it's time to cut the binding. I folded the fabric in half, selvage to selvage, and made sure the fold was nice and flat and even with no rippling or pulling. Then I sliver trimmed along the left-hand side to give myself a nice clean edge to measure from. I'm using my ruler to measure and cut 2 1/4 inch wide strips, walking my hand up the ruler as I cut so that the ruler doesn't swivel or shift. This is a good size quilt, so I'll need 7 strips in total. And I'll finish cutting the rest off camera. Since we're cutting on the cross grain, the strips will have just enough stretch to go around the corners if we sew them carefully. When I unfold the strips, you can see that there are no V-shapes, bulges, or irregular edges at the fold line. The strips are nice and even. Now we're ready to join the strips. I apologize for the weird angle of the camera, but hopefully you can still see that the fabrics are right sides together, overlapped so the selvages from each of the strips are just peeking out. We'll sew from crevice to crevice, joining the strips on the bias. You can mark the stitching line if you find it helpful, and many people do. Although I've made so many bindings that I don't bother anymore. I'm stitching each join from crevice to crevice, and then I'm going to chain stitch by stitching on air, so to speak, for just a couple of stitches, and then sliding the next pair of fabrics under my presser foot. Here we go. Again, stitching crevice to crevice, and these techniques help prevent the sewing machine from eating or scrunching the first stitch or two when you start sewing on a corner. Here comes the next set of strips. I'm overlapping them so that I can see the selvages peeking out. Now I'm going to take a couple stitches on air and then stitch from crevice to crevice right across. All right, hopefully you get the idea, and we'll just keep going until all of the strips have been joined. I'm using a blade saver thread cutter with an old rotary cutter blade inside to cut the threads between the joins, but any scissors or thread snips that you have will do. Once I get them cut apart, the next step is to trim away the excess fabric, including where the selvages extended past the overlap strips. Now, even after all these years, I still open up the strip to check everything is okay before I cut away. Here, there's the little bit of the selvage. Now I'm cutting parallel to the stitching line. And then I'll turn the scissors to catch the rest of that little bit of selvage. And you want to leave a seam allowance that's approximately 1/4 inch wide. This seam allowance does not need to be exact. You can eyeball it. And next, I like to get my fingernail in there and use my fingernail to press the seams open as I go. This will help distribute the bulk of the seam allowance and will make things easier as we go on. I'll show you just one more before we finish off camera. I'm pulling it down, checking, make sure it looks good. It does. Looks good, so I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to start by cutting that little bit of selvage, and then I'm going to cut parallel to the stitching line, and this will create my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then I'm catching the rest of that little bit of selvage. Then I'm opening it up again. There we go. And I'll turn it over. Now, this one is fighting me a little bit, but I'm trying to get my fingernail in there. And then I'm going to press that seam allowance open. Okay, there we go. And I'll finish the rest off camera. Now for a quick press to make sure that there are no creases or fold lines in the binding and that the seam allowances are nice and flat. I'll do this for the entire length of the binding. And don't worry about the heat of my iron radiating through my wool mat to damage the cutting mat. I have a board between the wool mat and my cutting mat, and that will protect it from the heat. Now to press the binding in half. Notice that I'm bringing the edges of the fabric together just a little bit at a time, and that I'm careful to press on the grain of the fabric straight along the fold or straight from the fold to the edges of the fabric. I'm never pressing or pulling on the diagonal, which could cause the edges of the fabric to become misaligned, either while we're pressing or later when we're sewing. Being careless at this step can cause a lot of problems later on, so make sure to take your time. It's not difficult, you just need to do it carefully. This next step is optional, but I find it super helpful. I'm winding my binding around a binding baby. I'm going to speed this up while I talk. This step will help keep the binding nice and flat without stretching or becoming distorted later. If you don't have a nifty gadget like this, you can wind your bobbin around something else, an empty spool of thread, or an empty thread spool, I should say, works really well, but even an empty toilet paper roll will work just fine. You'll see how this will also help make managing the length of the binding easier later on when I'm sewing it. There'll be no more dragging on the floor, no more getting caught under my chair, and no more getting tangled up with the kitties, as does happen at my house sometimes. So it's going to take a hot minute to get this wound since the binding is so long, but you'll see in a second how much easier this is going to be to handle. And once I get it on there, I'm going to use a pin just to secure it in place until I'm ready to start sewing. There we go. Now I'm going to show you the tuck-in method for starting and ending the binding process. I'm going to start by unfolding the binding strip, if I can get it to cooperate. There we go. I'll unfold it. And then I'm going to trim off a triangle at a 45-degree angle with the high side on the right as I'm looking at the back of the fabric. There we go. Next, we're going to fold over a 1/4-inch hem, and it doesn't need to be perfect 1/4-inch. Just fold it over to create a hem along the top of the strip and press to set the crease. Next, we'll take our still unfolded strip and place it on the back of the quilt, not the front, the back of the quilt where we want to attach the binding. And in order to create a little pocket to slide the other end of the binding in later, I placed a pin about 6 inches down from the tip of the binding, a locking stitch or back stitch to secure my threads, and then a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and this time it needs to be an accurate, consistent 1/4-inch seam allowance to attach the binding to the back side of the quilt. If you have a machine that can automatically adjust to the depth of whatever you're sewing on, you can use your 1/4-inch foot, as I am. Otherwise, you might want to use a walking foot. Now, I anchored the beginning of the binding by sewing the first 6 inches or so of the open binding through the bottom layer only. Now, I've stopped since I reached the pin, did a locking stitch, and cut my threads. Since we're sewing through a lot of layers, you might find it helpful to adjust your stitch length just a little bit longer than normal. Next, I'll pull out the pin and refold the strip along our original fold line. I'll find where I stopped stitching, and there it is. There's where I stopped stitching, and I'm going to slide this back under the machine, and I'll start sewing again with another locking stitch or back stitch. And then from here on out, I'm going to be sewing through both layers of binding. And this will leave an open pocket at the beginning of the binding. Now I'm getting ready to round the first corner. Notice that I've really slowed down my machine for this curve. I know a lot of you like to go really fast, but this is a step where it really pays to slow down and work carefully so that you don't have to do any ripping out and resewing later. I'm wearing a quilting glove on my left hand. This is optional, but I find that it gives me better traction on the fabric and it helps me control the quilt more easily. I'm holding the binding in my right hand and slowly bringing it around to match the edge of the quilt about an inch before it reaches the presser foot. So you're not trying to keep everything all lined up, only about an inch at a time. It's important to pull gently on the binding to stretch it just a little bit as it goes around the curve, and this will help it lie nice and flat on the other side. But only do this on the curves. Don't stretch the binding at all on the straight sections. Just a little bit of stretching gently on the curves. I thought it might be helpful to pull back for a second and show you my setup when I'm sewing a binding on a large quilt. I like to position a long board to support the quilt on my left side so that I don't have to pull against the weight of the quilt as I'm working. You can see a cutting mat peeking out from underneath the quilt in the bottom of the photo. It's there to help the quilt slide more easily across the board. Now that the binding has been sewn to the back of the quilt, let's prepare it for wrapping around to the front. This priming step is optional, but I find that it really helps create a nice and crisp finished binding, and it reduces the stress on my hands when I'm wrapping the binding around in the next step. I'm gently pulling the binding away from the initial stitching line and pressing towards the outer fold with a hot, dry iron. Don't try to flatten the curves. They're going to stand up. So don't try to flatten those. Just use the tip of the iron to push the fabric away from the stitching line. And when you're on the straight sections, you'll be able to press it pretty flat. Work your way all the way around the quilt. The next step is to flip the quilt over and start wrapping the binding around the edge of the quilt. You can glue base the binding, although if you do, remember to use tiny drops of water-soluble glue. Don't glop the glue on so that it saturates the layers of fabric. If you do, it will harden and it'll be a lot harder to sew through and it'll be a lot harder to wash out. Since I glue basted in the previous video, I'm going to use clips this time. And yes, I'm using the clips technically upside down, but I find that it holds the binding flatter on the front of the quilt this way. Be careful to make sure that the binding is consistent in width as you wrap it around. You can measure occasionally as you go, or you might find it more helpful to do as I do and use the width of your finger as a reference. On the home stretch, we're almost ready to start top stitching the binding onto the front of the quilt. I used a straight stitch to top stitch the binding down in the previous binding video. This is what it looked like on the front of the quilt and on the back. I could do the same for this quilt, again slowing down on the curves, but I'm planning to show you another option. This time, I'm going to set my machine for a small zigzag stitch. We're looking for a stitch that is small enough to be nearly invisible when you straddle the edge of the fabric, but large enough that you can see what you're doing. If it's too narrow, you risk not catching the edge of the binding. If it's too wide or too short, the stitch will be very visible. If it's too long, it won't hold the curve securely. We're looking for that Goldilocks setting where the stitch is about the same in length and width, but is still small enough to disappear into the fabric. Since I don't have a thread that matches my binding as well as I'd like it to, I'm using neutral gray 100 weight micro quilter thread from Superior Threads. And as you can see here, this strong but very fine thread is practically invisible in the finished binding. I used a white 60 weight polyester thread in my bobbin since my backing fabric is such a light color. Since the thread I'm using is so fine, I'm using a top stitch needle size 70-10. Top stitch needles are similar to quilting needles as they have very sharp tapered points and reinforced shafts. But remember, unlike thread, with needles, the smaller the number, the smaller the needle. So this needle will make a very small hole, which is perfect for my very fine thread. If you're using heavier thread than I am, such as the 50 weight cotton that you probably use to piece your quilt with, then you'll need a larger needle, such as a 75 quilting needle or maybe an 80 top stitching needle. I'll start stitching on a straight section, beginning with a back stitch or a locking stitch. When you're using a zigzag, one side of the stitch should go into the quilt right next to the binding, while the other side of the zigzag goes into the binding itself. Since I used clips, which don't hold the binding as flat as glue basting would, I'm using my finger to flatten the binding as it reaches the presser foot. Just remember to keep your finger in front of the foot and don't reach so far that you sew into your fingernail. It's happened. I'll work my way around the quilt, ending with a backing stitch or a locking stitch. Here's one of the finished corners. Doesn't it look great? Now, if you find that a corner wants to curl up a little when you're done instead of laying flat, just give it a good press with your iron. If it's particularly stubborn, you can give it a quick shot of best press or a quick shot of steam and then press it, and that should do the trick. Here's a close-up of the back of the quilt. Because the binding is wider on the front and skinny on the back, the zigzag stitching runs parallel to the binding on the back of the quilt, which gives us a neat and tidy finish on both sides. Now, when you first start out, the stitching line on the back might look a little wobbly, but no worries. That's why we use blending thread. Ta-da! We're done. There's a link in the description to my online shop where you'll find patterns, classes, and freebies. And please don't forget to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. Thank you, and happy quilting.